Why do more Americans live on the East Coast than the West Coast? Look at this map. The difference is impossible to ignore. America's population is divided between two very different coasts. The East Coast is older, more densely populated, and filled with historic cities like New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C. The West Coast is larger and more spread out, with major hubs like Los Angeles and San Francisco. But the reasons behind this huge population gap go much deeper than just geography. Driving through the West Coast desert feels like traveling through nothing but endless sand and mountains. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, the lights of Las Vegas appear, one of the brightest and most famous cities on Earth. From the silent deserts of the West, the landscape completely transforms as you reach California's coastline. The Pacific Coast Highway takes you along one of the most beautiful roads in America, where ocean views, cliffs, and places like Malibu create the iconic image of the California coast. California alone has around 39 million residents, making it the most populated state in America. But why do more people live on the east side of the U.S.? Because the East had the better starting conditions. The first major American cities developed along the Atlantic coast because it was connected to Europe through shipping routes. But the bigger reason is geography. The eastern United States simply had more advantages for large-scale settlement and economic growth. It had more rivers, more rainfall, easier transportation routes, and more land suitable for agriculture. These natural advantages helped create a stronger economic foundation. But then the question becomes, if the West has so much land, why don't more people live there? The answer comes down to one thing. Not all land is equally valuable for human settlement. The western United States looks huge on a map, but a large part of it is extremely difficult to live in. Take the Great Basin and the Southwest. These areas have some of the lowest population densities in the entire country because they are dominated by deserts, mountains, and limited water supplies. And water is the biggest factor. Cities need reliable water sources for drinking, agriculture, and industry. But much of the West receives far less rainfall than the East. Places like Nevada, Arizona, and Utah depend on complex water systems that transport water across hundreds of miles. Without massive engineering projects, many of today's western cities would not even exist. The landscape itself is another challenge. The West is filled with huge mountain ranges, including the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada. These create natural barriers that make transportation, construction, and connecting cities much more expensive. On the East Coast, cities can grow closer together because the terrain is generally easier to build on. But in the West, you can drive for hours and still find mountains, deserts, or empty land separating major population centers. This affects the economy too. Businesses usually want to be near large pools of workers, customers, and infrastructure. When cities are far apart, building transportation networks and supplying resources becomes more expensive. That is why population in the West is concentrated in a few specific areas where geography allows it. The coast of California, the Puget Sound region around Seattle, and some desert cities with access to water became major economic centers. But between these places are enormous areas where very few people live. So the western United States is not empty because people don't want to live there. It is empty because geography sets limits. Another reason the East Coast became so densely populated is its geography. The coastline has many natural harbors, shorter travel distances between major cities, and a long history of connected communities. Even today, cities across the East Coast form one of the largest urban corridors in the world, stretching from Boston to Washington, D.C., where millions of people live close together. One interesting advantage of the East Coast is its location. It is much closer to Europe than the West Coast, which made it the first major gateway for immigration, trade, and cultural exchange. Even today, cities like New York and Boston remain some of America's most internationally connected places. Back to the West. Unlike the East Coast, which developed many cities close together, the West Coast often grew around individual economic centers. Hollywood in Los Angeles, technology in Silicon Valley, and aerospace in Seattle attracted millions, but mostly into a few major hubs. One thing that makes the West Coast unique is that many of its biggest cities are relatively young compared to the East Coast. Los Angeles, Seattle, and San Francisco experienced their biggest growth much later, especially during the 20th century, when cars, aviation, technology, and entertainment transformed the region. Los Angeles shows the West Coast pattern perfectly. It became one of America's largest cities without being built around an old colonial center. Instead, it expanded outward through suburbs, highways, and a car-based lifestyle. Another major difference between the West Coast and the East Coast is the cost of living. Some of the most expensive places in America are located on the West Coast, especially in California. Cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego have extremely high housing costs because millions of people want to live near the coast, while available land is limited. This creates a unique situation. The West Coast has some of the highest-paying jobs in the country, especially in technology and entertainment, but housing prices have grown even faster. As a result, many people move farther inland or to other states where their money can go further. The East Coast also has expensive cities like New York and Boston, but it has a wider range of affordable areas because of its larger network of cities and suburbs. Cost of living on the West Coast is not only about housing. Even everyday things like grocery shopping can be more expensive in many coastal cities. Prices for food, restaurants, and basic services are often higher because operating costs, wages, and demand are higher. People often pay more for everyday products compared to many other parts of the country. Even a simple trip to the supermarket can cost noticeably more, especially in areas where space is limited and transportation costs are higher. This is one reason why many residents choose to live farther away from the coast. They can save money on groceries, rent, and daily expenses while still commuting to major cities for work. From the historic cities of the East Coast to the wide landscapes of the West, both sides of America have shaped the country in different ways. The East became a population center through centuries of growth and connection, while the West grew around innovation, space, and opportunity. In the end, America's population map is a story of geography, history, and where people choose to build their lives. Thanks for watching.